If you've been following Unsung Heroes for some time, you'll have probably noticed that we don't tend to talk about vintage cars quite as often as classic or modern vehicles. But that's not to say that there aren't vintage cars that deserve attention, and this is a prime example. In fact, this car, the 1926 Renault 40CV, the streamlined coupe version in particular, is a car that was on my original shortlist of about 20 or 30 cars for Unsung Heroes. So it's an OG of this series, even though it's taken much longer than that to actually get around to talking about this beast, because that's exactly what this is. Even by today's standards, some of this car's numbers are very impressive. Other ones, not so much, but certainly of its time. Now, the first thing that you'd probably assume is that it's absolutely massive. It certainly looks it. But then, if you look at the size of the drivers and mechanics standing next to it, it's not quite as big as you might think. It looks about as big as a fire truck. It's actually not. It's about 3.5 to 4 meters long, depending on the model variation, and not particularly tall either. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the 40CV, it does not always look like this. In fact, the normal versions look totally different. They look much more like the big vintage cars with the two-tone paint and the four doors that you would think of this kind of era, like the big Cadillacs and Duesenbergs and various other things, of course, from all over the world. And even those normal versions had very large engines. This, for instance, is a 9.1 litre straight six, putting out 140 horsepower. Now, 140 horsepower does not sound very impressive at all by today's standards, but you've got to bear in mind that back in 1926, that was almost 3 times more powerful than a Dodge. That's a lot of power for a Renault to have. Now, the car was designed for an interesting purpose, and a fairly obvious one based on the looks, because they made a very extensive overhaul to the car's visuals with the streamliner body, the single seat layout which allowed it to be much narrower, the first Renault to actually have an exposed radiator grille which also sets it apart from the normal one, and it's designed to fairly obviously be a speed record car. And of course, back then, just like now, you've got all these teams and all these manufacturers going back and forth trying to beat each other with various records, and this is one of those cars that wasn't just going for outright speed, it was going for average speeds over distance and over time. In particular, over 24 hours. Now, Renault actually had records before, but had lost them to other manufacturers, and they wanted to claim them back. But they wanted to go bigger and better and really beat the opposition. And that's where this car comes in, because it did exactly that. In fact, over a 24-hour period, this car destroyed a number of records, including holding an average speed over 50 miles of around 120 miles per hour. Again, this is 1926 we're talking about, and over a 24-hour period, including multiple pit stops and a reported 1,000 tyres that the vehicle got through. And in fact, I believe that was the vehicle that predated this one, so this one probably got through slightly less tyres than that, but still a huge amount, hundreds no doubt. It averaged about 108 miles per hour. Or 174 kilometers per hour. Once again, very, very impressive for the time. Now, the car, of course, is not fast by today's standards, and the only thing that's still impressive about it would be probably the sheer capacity of the engine. A 9.1 litre is still huge, even today. That's bigger than pretty much any supercar on the market, but what the car did in its day is amazing. It's an awesome speed record car, one of the most distinctive cars of its time for sure, with the bright blue paint, the crazy looking body, and in some ways it could actually pass for a much newer car with the kind of visual flair that something like the Jay Leno tank car would have. And of course that was built in 2003, 2004. So I think this is a very cool vintage car, not really the kind of thing that you think of when you think of Renault, especially not these days, but what a machine. It was awesome back then how you just had sheer brute force trying to break these records, massive torque, massive engines, massive power, and this was a perfect example. It's something of a hot rod, if you will, but a very, very clever one for its time, very aerodynamically advanced in its day, very quick, and although it's an unsung hero in the general sense, it's actually one of the slightly better known cars of this series, it's unsung in as much as people who are not vintage fans just don't have a clue about this thing. Most people have never heard of it, never even seen it, and if you have seen it, you wouldn't really know it was a Renault unless you knew your Renaults. So from that point of view, I think it definitely deserves being here. It's a very cool car, a very significant one, certainly for Renault and for the car world in general, and a car which ran not in this form but in its regular form from 1911 all the way up to 1928. It's a car that made its mark, not just as a street car, a production car, but as a speed car. That would be like today if, for instance, Bugatti made the Veyron, but also made the regular Veyron have 4 doors and 5 seats. That's the kind of thing that would happen as today's equivalent of what this thing did back then, which, when you think of it that way, it's pretty crazy and pretty impressive as well. But that's it overall for my thoughts on the Renault 40CV. I would definitely recommend, as with any of these episodes, checking it out on the net if you'd like to learn even more about the people behind it. And I want to send out much love to the people involved in the pit stops. They had a 14-person team, and great job, because of course those guys were as important as the driver and even the people behind making the car, because if those pit stops took too long, your average speed starts to drop real fast. And with the amount of pit stops that you have to do, it adds up very, very quickly. So a great all-round effort from the team, a remarkable car, and of course, click here on screen to see previous episodes in this series. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.